Today I want to talk once more about something German, guilt pride. I spoke about it in earlier videos, but I'll discuss it more comprehensively now. Guilt pride has its historical predecessors, particularly in Christian religion. But in its contemporary secular and political form, I believe it is a German invention, made in Germany, by Germans and for Germans. As many other things made in Germany, though, it's been found globally useful and became an export hit, an Exportschlager. An innovative technology not for building cars or engines, but for creating political identity all over the world. We'll get to that soon, but let's start now with a little genealogy of the birth of guilt pride out of the German spirit, die Geburt des Schuldstolzes aus dem Geiste der Deutschen. After the Nazi catastrophe, the failed project to establish the Germans as the master race dominating the world, Germany and the Germans ended up completely destroyed in 1945, not just militarily, economically and politically, but also morally and reputationally. The German brand had been fundamentally tarnished. After Hitler, the Germans became arch-villains of the world. And yet, out of the ruins of the Second World War, Germany managed to quickly re-emerge, first economically and then politically, when it was reunified in 1990. And in the few decades since then, Germany also succeeded in rebranding itself. Guilt pride gave the Germans a new national confidence. Before reunification in 1990, the two distinct Germanys had tried different strategies to cope with the Nazi past and to find a new national identity. Communist East Germany defined itself as anti-fascist. It was founded by people who had fought against the Nazis and suffered persecution. A regime of the good guys, on the right side of history, it seemed. However, the totalitarian aspects of the state soon put this good guy image into question. The desired profile of Eastern Germany as glorious anti-fascist German people's democracy was not always credible. Western Germany had chosen a different strategy, a mixture of Wiedergutmachung, an atonement by restorative justice, and Vergangenheitsbewältigung, overcoming of the past, was meant to eventually draw a line, a Schlussstrich, underneath the past and allow a cleansed Germany to move on and get a fresh start. That final line, however, remained elusive. The past was just not going away. After reunification, the two old approaches were gradually replaced with a new common civil religion for all Germans, Erinnerungskultur, or culture of remembrance. Unlike its Eastern and Western German predecessors, Erinnerungskultur gave up the attempt at a dissociation from the Nazi past. The new national pride was neither to be found in claiming a communist heritage, nor in establishing a clean Germany that had left Nazism once and for all behind. Instead, the new Germany was to pledge an everlasting inherited responsibility for the Nazi crimes. Erinnerungskultur turned out to be much better at generating national pride than its predecessors. 21st century Germany found heroism and distinction in fessing up to a seemingly unprecedented guilt. Precisely this almost superhuman willingness to confess to a crime greater than ever confessed, and to declare it a national original sin for eternity, generated a paradoxical new moral glory. As the world champions in admitting evilness, the most chastened Germans were now also the most morally considerate and responsible people, the most morally aware of all. Out of the greatest guilt, greatest righteousness was born. Guilt pride became the foundation of a new German superiority complex, a German moral standard the whole world ought to look up to as a benchmark. As mentioned, guilt pride as such is not new. But given its origin in the Holocaust, the peculiar German variety is rather recent. Another peculiarity of German guilt pride that makes it so contemporary is it is decidedly post-authentic. Unlike regular guilt, German guilt pride does not come from deep within the individual. Instead, it has been institutionalized. People are trained in it by education and by the media. It's not just personally felt, but publicly displayed and performed for everyone to see. It is guilt under conditions of prophylicity. Along with Erinnerungskultur, guilt pride blossomed in the 1990s. This was right after the end of the Cold War, when great geopolitical shifts were taking place. And it was also the time of a generational shift. People who had lived through Nazi times were dead, or dying, or going into retirement. A new generation was taking over. And what's more, the 1990s were also the decade when the new media evolved. TV had just been privatized in most of Europe. The whole media landscape was in turmoil. And soon enough, the internet spread and changed everything. When Erinnerungskultur was massively promoted all over Germany, most powerfully manifested by the gigantic Holocaust memorial in the center of Berlin, which soon became a prime tourist hotspot, not everyone was happy. Especially the older generation was suspicious. They couldn't express it exactly, but many felt something fishy was going on. Here's one example of the early discontent with guilt pride. In 1998, Martin Walser, an old leftist and arguably the most famous living German writer at the time, we had to read his works back in high school, was given the prestigious Peace Prize of the German book trade. His acceptance speech caused a major controversy because it expressed a discomfort with Erinnerungskultur. Walser said, "I want to understand why, in this decade, the past is presented like never before. When I realize that something within me rises in opposition to this, I try to detect the motivation behind this display of our disgrace." Walser's statement was soon scandalized by the already largely pro-guilt pride German media, academic, cultural, and political scenes. He was accused of wanting to hide the German disgrace, or even worse, of not really regarding this disgrace as a disgrace, and being a clandestine Nazi apologist. Such accusations continue until today. But Walser wasn't excusing Nazism. Instead, he said two things. First, the heavy emphasis on public display in Erinnerungskultur was somehow appalling to him. And second, he didn't really understand why he felt that way. Now here's a potential explanation. Other than most promoters of guilt pride, Walser, born in 1927, had lived through the war. As a teenager, he had served in the German army and, unknowingly, as he maintained, was even listed as a Nazi party member in 1944. It's likely that he felt guilty about his involvement in all of this and could not happily embrace the proud display of Nazi crimes. Erinnerungskultur seemed strange and even perverse to him, precisely because the Nazi times had been an authentically traumatic experience for him. What Walser apparently not understood was that Erinnerungskultur was made mostly by and for those who, unlike him, had no Erinnerung, no personal memory of the Nazi times. It was a political and psychological Inszenierung, a staging after the fact, for those born after 1945. Guilt pride is guilt and pride by proxy. Being post-authentic, guilt pride is paradoxically felt about something one did not do oneself. For Walser, a writer still deeply rooted in the age of authenticity, Erinnerungskultur was one huge spectacle, in Guy Debord's sense of this term, of mass and media events full of pompous appearances. The culture of remembrance was an inauthentic culture of an inauthentic remembrance. But then, What other option did the proponents of Erinnerungskultur have? This generation born after 1945 that was now taking over the media and politics found themselves burdened with a negative national profile and with a guilt that they could never authentically feel. And yet they had to identify with this guilt in a world that still conceived of Germany as the nation of the former Nazis. At the same time, a rising identity politics was enabling discriminated groups like blacks or LGBTQ people to embrace their formerly negative image with a new and open pride. But such a direct route to pride was not an option for the Germans. They had been the perpetrators, not the victims. They couldn't stage a proud to have been a Nazi parade. They had to take the detour through guilt to pride. And this guilt was a virtual and a spectacular guilt, a guilt curated as a collective profile. In times of profilicity, collective profile curation has become a prime function of politics. All mainstream German parties from the 1990s until today emphatically promoted Erinnerungskultur. Cultivating a new national profile for Germans has been a centerpiece of their political legitimacy. And it is also central to their current combat against a rising right-wing opposition. Importantly, guilt pride not only works at home in Germany, it also became a popular German expert item, a new technology for building profiles anywhere. The miracle of guilt pride lies in the reversal of the moral code. It can transform badness into goodness. And this feature has been incorporated into wokeism and helped its global rise. Wokeism is a profiling technology that enables potentially suspicious groups or individuals, for instance, political parties, corporations, elite universities, or simply white people, to preventatively redeem themselves and display moral superiority. And yet, as we know from Hegel and Marx, nothing in world history can escape its inner contradictions. A dialectical turning point of German guilt pride was reached in 2015, when Erinnerungskultur was enriched by a new, seemingly even more glorious sequel, Willkommenskultur, or welcoming culture. During the refugee crisis in 2015, Germany proudly proclaimed that migrants fleeing the Middle East and other regions were warmly welcome, and millions heeded the call. The New York Times titled appropriately, "As Germany takes in refugees, it also rehabilitates its image." By welcoming non-white migrants in such large numbers, Germany fulfilled the promise of the culture of remembrance. It showed the world and itself that it was taking on responsibility for its racist past and was now really nice to people of foreign and especially non-Aryan origins. As the New York Times headline suggested, Willkommenskultur seemed to be the icing on the cake of its big rebranding project. However, soon enough, the Germans realized that in their initial enthusiasm, they had overlooked a major problem with these refugees. To eventually become good Germans, the refugees would also have to practice German guilt pride, of course. But most of them felt little connection with the Nazi crimes. And to make things worse, much worse actually, many were ardent supporters of the Palestinian cause and did not have a very high opinion of the State of Israel. This caused a major conundrum, given that the core value of German guilt pride is, in reaction to the Holocaust, the unflinching support for Israel as a Jewish state. Very soon it became clear that the culture of remembrance and welcoming culture were not as compatible as it had seemed. Those that had been welcomed didn't want to remember what the Germans asked them to. That soon made them not that welcome anymore. Suddenly, the core contradiction of guilt pride came to the fore. On the surface, guilt pride is for the sake of others. In reality, though, guilt pride had always already been, first and foremost, for the sake of the Germans themselves. The point was to build a new identity that the Germans could be truly invested in and that would generate profile value for them, not for refugees and not for whomever else, and not even, as we will see, for Jews. In practice, this means Muslim refugees are welcome in Germany in as far as they, as the New York Times put it, contribute to the rehabilitation of the German image. The actual grievances, issues, and causes, or their identity, does not matter that much. Their prime function, next to providing cheap labor, of course, is to prove to the Germans and to the world how good the Germans are. The inner contradiction of guilt pride, that it seems to be immoral, but is in fact a profile technology, becomes glaringly obvious in the German reaction to the current situation in the Middle East. Germany has been, next to the USA, the most outspoken supporter of Israel and its military actions, which, at the time of recording this video, have caused nearly 50,000 deaths. As many observers noted, the inner logic of German guilt pride is not the commitment to be on the side of whoever is threatened by genocide, but instead to be seen as being on the side of the core asset of German guilt pride, symbolically manifested in Israel as a Jewish state, no matter what's going on in reality. The new German civil religion of guilt pride is becoming increasingly zealous and fundamentalist. In its name, many of those who were emphatically welcomed less than a decade ago are now almost as emphatically disciplined. Here are two examples of a recent legal, political, and media purge aimed quite directly at people with an immigration background. First, in August 2024, a woman was sentenced and fined by a German court for using the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Under certain conditions, this slogan is criminalized in Germany. The woman has an Iranian background. Her parents were communists fleeing political persecution. She is now facing persecution in Germany. The judge apparently stated that the use of the pro-Palestinian slogan violates German Staatsräson. That is to say, it violates the national principle of support for Israel as a Jewish state in Palestine that every German ought to obey. Second, for the very same reason of affirming the core commandment of German guilt pride, people applying for German citizenship now have to pass a test, questioning their beliefs in this matter. Accordingly, the German state-owned media Deutsche Welle declared recently, whoever promotes the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which is considered anti-Semitic in Germany, may well be excluded from acquiring citizenship. Ironically, the zealous protection of German guilt pride also extends to a significant number of Jewish people. Even for Jews, it's not okay to mess with the new German profile. Let's hear about this from Slavoj Žižek.
This is why in another of my recent texts I called for a cultural boycott, at least of Germany. What is happening now in Germany is obscene. You know that they have now such strict standards. For example, if you say Palestinians suffer, and if you don't say in the same sentence, but this suffering was caused by Hamas, so it's basically Hamas which is responsible, not Israel, you are considered already, it's not a joke, you are considered anti-Semitic. And so now a friend of mine made a statistic. A little bit over 1,000 people were seriously affected by this campaign against what they call anti-Semitism. Like losing their job, being cancelled, and so on in public life. But you know the true horror. 1/3 of them are Jews.
The most renowned philosopher among the many Jewish people bullied in Germany for violating German guilt pride was Nancy Fraser. Her visiting professorship at Cologne University was cancelled in May this year. And the contradictions of guilt pride are currently reaching a new height. Because of their quite drastic electoral decline, the German mainstream parties, including the Greens, are now suddenly embracing anti-immigration policies originally promoted by their right-wing nemesis, the AfD party. But with one decisive difference. Unlike the AfD, the mainstream parties promise to curb immigration while at the same time protecting the guilt pride profile. This is why support of Israel is once again such a central point for them. It connects the insistence on guilt pride with new policies which are, in practice, directed mostly at Muslim immigrants. To conclude, what I'd like to highlight is not the moral paradox of German guilt pride, which many people, including Zizek, have already pointed out. As a result of confessing to a genocide, military violence resulting in tens of thousands of killings is enabled. What I'd like to highlight is instead that guilt pride, on a deeper level, is not a moral project, but a profile project. It is about the creation of a collective identity and the formation of personal investment in it. It is a technology for building a sense of superiority. As an identity project, guilt pride once more establishes divisions between true Germans and their enemies. As a civil religious practice, it's at the verge of becoming a new obsessive pursuit of German purity, giving rise to political illiberalism. Somehow it seems the Germans just can't help being overly German.